everybody. Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah.
I'm Warren Phillips.
And you get both of us. Isn't that great? I forgot to mention that on Monday's episode, but it's amazing to be doing some episodes, or at least intros together. But this one is an episode we also did together. Can you believe it? We exist in the same reality and also talk to the same guests. So this one is with Bret Blevins, who is an amazing veteran artist. You know him from a number of movie adaptations. He worked on New Mutants for a while. I know him from Sleepwalker, which was that 90s property, sort of short-lived, but made a big impression on me at least. And, you know, hundreds of other things. He's really had a long and varied career, and we were very excited to talk to him.
Yeah, and also I know him from Batman. And of course, he is part of the long lineage of Phantom artists. I think we've had just about every Phantom artist except Lee Falcon. But yeah, Bret is really gives a lot of insightful answers. We so enjoyed this conversation because we learned a lot about him and learned a lot about the industry as well. This is one of my top 10 episodes of all time. So here we are, Bret Blevins. And we are so absolutely thrilled today to be speaking to Mr. Bret Blevins. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're more than welcome.
So let's start at the very, very beginning. How did you first discover comic books?
Let's see. I've told this story before, but when I was really small, my dad worked for United Airlines, and I was born in 1960, so I'm going pretty far back here. But before I was in school, I was really small. He had a friend who loved to read comics, and he just bought them, threw them in a box. So one day he asked my dad, "Hey, you've got a kid. Would you like these comics?" So I remember them stacking them up on the couch, and they were taller than I was. But they had all the early Marvels and Dennis the Menace and Disney. He just read everything. So, I was fascinated with them. I think I probably helped me learn to read because I wanted to find out what they were saying. You see all these exciting pictures. But then later on, I also had an uncle, and I was like any kid. I just took comics along with everything else that, television or movies or cartoons. But I had an uncle who was really into the stuff. He was about 13 years older than I. So when I got to be 10, 11, this would be 1970, 71, he was really neck deep in that resurgence of the illustrated interest, Bernie Wrightson, Jeff Jones, Kaluta, Barry Smith. And he was reading a lot of pulp, so he would hand me off all these Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, so the Frazetta covers. So it all seemed pretty fascinating. I remember he got me a subscription to the Monster Times. I don't know if you guys remember that. It was a tabloid, newspaper tabloid, all about history of fantasy. But so that would be the time I got really serious about drawing all the time. I was really fascinated with all the imagery.
So how was the decision made in your life to pursue comics as a career?
Largely because I really loved drawing, and I had fallen in love with all the illustrated books in the library. When I got to school, all the old N.C. Wyeth and Howard Pyle, and there's a lot of really excellent kids books illustrators from that era. Pen and ink artists, Joe and Beth Crush. And that just fascinated me. I was always fascinated to see how the text translated into the different interpretations, because you could get 10 versions of Treasure Island, and they were all different. And so I think somehow I got interested in the connection between the narrative and how someone would envision it. And I ended up in comics largely. When I first thought about maybe being an artist, I was probably 12 or 13. Loved doing it. And it certainly seemed more attractive than a lot of the other jobs I saw around me. So, of which I had my share before I finally got started. But I was narrative picture making, I guess is what it was. I just thought I'd love to tell some kind of narrative event in a picture. Seemed like a really interesting problem. And then I originally thought I would do paperback covers, or I was thinking more in terms of single images. But then by the time I got old enough to seriously have a chance of doing it, that business was dying. I mean, they weren't paying anything anymore, which I found out when I got to New York. but, about the comics were exploding.
Mhm.
So I got drawn into it almost sideways.
Okay.
And then once I started doing it full time, then I completely fell in love with the storytelling part of it.
I read that you had started out, or maybe one of your first jobs was as a local newspaper cartoonist. So doing the comic
That's right.
strips, is that right?
They weren't comic strips, they were political cartoons. And we had
Oh, okay.
when I was a teenager, I lived in Nevada. As a child, I lived in Georgia. We moved to Nevada. My dad had always loved the mists of the West. So when he had a chance to go west and keep his job, we went out there. But there was a place there called the Nevada Legal News. I don't know if this is regional or if it's not true anymore, but in those days, you had to have a separate newspaper. It was a small newspaper that just printed all the results of all the court proceedings and all the legal stuff that was going on. So that's all they did.
Mhm.
Pretty boring to read as a newspaper, but they had political cartoons that were local about Las Vegas things. So I didn't often come up with the gags because I didn't. I mean, occasionally I had a generic one, but I didn't follow. I was 15, something.
Mhm.
You know?
Right.
And the office was like 15-minute bike ride from the high school. So I just, after school, I'd bike up there. They'd tell me what it was. I often drew it right there in the office. And they printed it there too. They had a mimeograph printer and everything. Occasionally I'd pick up extra money by helping them collate pamphlets and stuff like that. But yeah, I did that for quite a while. He paid me $5 a cartoon, but the comics were 20 cents, 25 cents, whatever they were at that time, maybe up to 35 by then. So that went a long way, you know.
For sure. And this was yet another example of your early thought process in terms of making single images. What was the transition like between, when you were thinking of doing book covers and you were doing these political cartoons versus, the storytelling that came along with comic books? What was that transition like for you? Was it a rocky one?
It seemed very natural because I also love film. And I think just, well, I remember later on, I'm jumping ahead here, but it kind of applies. Later on, mid 90s, I started doing storyboards for all the Bruce Timm shows. And when I learned that, which was very quick, I didn't have too much trouble with it. There was just a few technical rules of film. But I thought, this is what I've been trying to do all my life and didn't realize I was in the wrong business. Because I think that there's something fascinating about putting images together in a sequence that can tell any kind of story. So I was more interested in single images originally, but I was doing comic book samples because that seemed where the work was available. This would be 1980, 81, 79. I was still a teenager, but I started sending samples in when I was 13, though. I was getting a little ahead of myself. The first job that I did that was on a schedule was the movie adaptation of the Dark Crystal film. It was huge. It was 48 pages and painted cover, 2 other covers for the comic book versions. And it was already late when I got it. It was a total accidental story that I got that job. But being plunged into it after waiting so long and trying and doing all these different things, I was so ready that I just sunk into it. And I think I almost fell in love with comic book storytelling, doing that job. So by the end, my appetite was all wound up.
I was about to say, because you've worked early on in a lot of licensed properties. What was that experience like for you? Because some folks tell us that the people who own the license can be very hands-on. They want to see everything. They want everything to be to their specifications. Other folks say they're very laid back. Just do what you have to do. We just want to get the product out there. What was your experience like?
I think it probably varied a little with the project.
Okay.
Because that was the first one I did, and I was still living out west then. So as soon as that happened, then I was working all the time. So we were saving up to move to New York, which was always the goal.
Right.
My wife and I had been married only a year, I think, when we started that. But that I didn't have too much trouble with. We did have to make a lot of little storytelling corrections. So they flew me out once I had the whole thing penciled. And we did go back and forth for about a week to the Henson office, Jim Henson offices in New York,
Mhm.
And it was mostly things like, oh, they don't go out. It was gosh, I'm not going to be able to remember the characters' names, but the nice, goofy looking, vulture-y people. When
The
they,
Gelflings.
that's it. When the, well, no, it's those were the,
Oh, the Mystics.
yes, the
The-
Mystics, who had been split apart into
I don't know
evil
anything
and
about these
good or
movies.
something. Yeah. But I remember this one in specific. We came and she's turning the pages, and it said in the script something like they dissolved into flame or something.
Right.
So I had the outline flame, and she says, "Oh, we can't have flame. They just sort of sparkle and disappear in the movie. I don't want them to catch on fire." It would be stuff like that. So I just have to tone that down a little bit. But I didn't have to make any. I didn't really have to redraw any pages or anything on that one. In fact, I don't think I ever did that. It would be more like some technical thing that wasn't correct.
Mhm.
The worst thing I had was on one called The Last Starfighter.
Yep.
Mhm.
Very early days of computer generated.
Mhm.
The spaceships were computer generated. And someone, the studios or their licensing division or whatever would send the reference out. So someone sent us a bunch of very simple, like almost early Mario Brothers looking cube spaceship reference, but they had marked it upside down. So I had drawn like 20 pages of this thing, and I was drawing the ship upside down all the time. So I had to redraw it and paste it over, flip it over.
Right.
I couldn't just flip it because of the perspective. I had to redraw the thing. That was probably the biggest aggravating one.
Mhm.
But most of them went pretty well. I did the third Indiana Jones film.
Mhm.
And what's different now, later I did a whole bunch of stories of Pirates of the Caribbean for that little Disney digest.
Mhm.
And we couldn't do any likenesses of the actors.
Wow.
You could do a type,
Right.
I mean, and Jack Sparrow has those raccoon eyes and everything. He was pretty easy to nail without actually drawing Johnny Depp.
Right.
But earlier, they didn't seem to care. They sent me tons of reference, and I drew Harrison Ford and all the actors. No one seemed to care about that. So I think somewhere along the line, the contracts changed for actors where they had to get paid for the use of their likeness and approve it and everything.
Mhm.
I did one recently. I did a story with Louise Simonson, for the Wonder Woman, current Wonder Woman.
Okay.
And that again, I couldn't draw Godot, the actress,
Wow.
but it had to look like her.
Right.
So that was a little bit of a headache, but not. I mean, by that time, I'd been doing this a long time, so I figured out how to work around that.
I'm fascinated by the process of adaptation, especially from from a moving format like movies to comics. Although it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're never adapting a finished movie or maybe even a started movie. You're just working from a script the same as the people that are filming it. Is that correct?
Yes, it's often in progress, and occasionally you'll find a scene or something in the comic that they cut from the film. That's happened a few times. I think there's a couple of scenes in Alien, Walt Simonson drew, that weren't in the film, because they, by the time they edited the film for pacing or whatever. But we didn't. Well, I often would get the film script too, but then a comic book writer would break it down into panels and pages. And you always have some leeway there if you can move things around and make it a little more dramatic. But I think it was. I can't speak for the writers of those adaptations, but I would imagine it would be somewhat easier than starting from scratch because the narrative's already broken down, and then you're just kind of taking the highlights of what you can fit into your 48, 64 pages and trying to make that a compelling narrative as well. Because, a comic book is basically like a haiku, There's a lot of stuff that happens in the gutters.
Right.
You can't draw every sequence. So you just try and hit that rhythm with what you are able to show to do the best job you can of translating the film.
And from an artistic perspective, did you feel kind of like a chameleon in terms of like you didn't really have your own style? You'd have to apply what the tone of the movie and what the references suggested, or were you able to kind of put your stamp on it in some way?
Well, I have to say that back in those days, I didn't think too much about trying to put any kind of particular stamp on it. It was more, and no one ever asked me to. It was more of just trying to make it as dramatic as you could. You know, I mean, I loved the designs from the Dark Crystal, those Brian Froud designs. And I'll compress this into just a couple of minutes, but it's basically how I got started, really. Because I'd been working with Al Milgrom. He had a script that was, what they used to call it, not a backup, but anyway, it had no schedule to be printed. And
Fill in, maybe.
Fill in, yeah, that would be it. But there's another word for it, being in readiness in case it was suddenly.
Oh yeah.
But yeah,
I'll try to remember it too.
Yeah, but so I was working on that. So it was like 17 pages. So I would do it, send it in. He'd give me advice on it. I'd rework it. That had been going on for a few months by then. But what happened is every time I sent it back in, I would send more samples of just on my own of anything that interested me. So I'd seen a press book for that film, and it said at the bottom, you know, Marvel, or maybe it didn't. I don't even know why I did it, but I just love the way they looked. So I made up 4 pages of continuity, not knowing anything about the story. It was just a picture of all the designs. And I sent that in with this last batch. And that was a Shanna the She-Devil story. They actually eventually printed that. But so I sent that in, and it wasn't very long, like a week later, I got the script for the movie adaptation in the mail. So I thought, well, this must be a mistake, because those sample pages I sent in, you know, in those days, you would put your name and address at the top of each page, and very neat. And somebody must have seen that and made a mistake and sent this to me. So I called Al Milgrom. He said, I don't have any idea. I don't know what's going on. I'll find out who's editing that and see what's going on. Because I assumed I needed to send it to whoever it was actually supposed to go to. So about a half an hour later, Wheezy called me, and she said, hey, I saw those samples. I showed them to Henson. They love the way you draw the characters. So you're doing the book, and you got to start right away because it's already 5 weeks late. That was my introduction. So
right into the fire.
It really was. But by then I was 21.
Right.
So I could work 18 hours a day. You know, I was so excited, really thrilled by it.
I want to ask a little bit about the Bozz Chronicles, because you and Dave Michelinie worked together on the Epic line. So that gave you guys a lot more freedom. You know, you wouldn't have to stay within the confines of the Marvel universe.
Right.
What was that relationship like, and how did that project come together?
David actually called me.
Okay.
So maybe based on the Dark Crystal or something else that I'd done early on. And Epic was just starting, I think. That was a pretty early book. Yep. Because I'd come out for a week, met Wheezy and Archie Goodwin, everybody at Marvel. They were just wonderful to me. But so I might have even met him in the bullpen or something. It was so long ago. But he called me, and he had like 4 ideas that he wanted to pitch to Archie. And I picked that one because I always loved Victorian. And it was such an unusual character. I mean, you can't think of anyone who looks less heroic than Bozz.
Right.
You know, it was just an interesting challenge to play with his facial expressions, and he knew nothing about the customs of Earth, and he was very innocent. That appealed to me to try and express that. And I love drawing all that Victorian stuff. So, yeah, I'm trying to think. That was pretty early. It was like 84 or something. Yeah. So that's how that started, and we just worked it out. And I did the designs, and from there.
Was that your first project, starting at the ground floor and building up?
Yeah, it would be. Everything else I sort of came on as an already moving train.
Right.
But that would be one that I designed everything, started from scratch.
Now, did Marvel push the books as much as they could on that Epic line, did you feel?
I'm not too savvy on how everything was done back then. This was still fairly early days for a comic shop.
Right.
Or not comic shops per se, but what I mean is, you guys will know more about this than I do, but somewhere in there, they printed books just for comic books.
The direct market, yep.
Yeah, and that's a direct mark. So that was right around this time, maybe.
Okay.
So it was early days of that more special, and it was had better paper.
Right.
That's why I did all that pen and ink rendering, because they could reproduce it. So I don't remember. I mean, we did ads, and
Right.
people liked it. I think what was happening at that time was the intensity of the tsunami of X-Men was
Right.
just sort of starting to build and crest. So that's where all the attention was going, to that kind of stuff.
I just want to do one follow-up. Just speaking, how we spoke about you were working with Mr. Michelinie. What kind of relationship do you like with a writer? Do you like bouncing back and ideas off each other, or do you prefer, because there's some people who they don't even talk to the writer. They're just sort of
Right.
given this and then it just moves on to someone else. Which one do you prefer, or is it different for every project?
It's different for every project sometimes, because you don't really have a say as to how
Right.
it's going to unfold. But in those days, it was just a lot more casual. So we usually talked a lot on the phone, or actually met each other at the office. I mean, in those days, probably 90% of the people who worked in comics were around New York.
Yeah.
So you were always meeting in the offices, and it was very laid back. I mean, I have such wonderful memories of that time. It lasted about another 12, 15 years
Okay.
before after the whole explosion came, and then the Image grew out of that, where it really changed the business into a much more commercial.
Right.
Not that it wasn't always that. They didn't make comics for fun. They made them
Right.
to sell. But because of the amount of money that was coming through, it changed the nature of how everything was set up. But in those days, we just come into the office and you meet someone, and you're standing in somebody's office and you say, hey, what would be fun? If we, had Wolverine decide he wanted to take ballet lessons, whatever, you just say something. Well, that might be fun. It was about that serious.
Right.
If you could get someone to think it was fun to do, then they'd try it. I mean, it didn't have that crazy, like, 7-tiered editorial layer of approval that exists everywhere now. It was way more freewheeling. And so I remember it being very casual. You often, I mean, when I worked with Wheezy, we talked all the time.
Right.
Because also Marvel worked from plots. So I didn't have a script.
Right.
And often, especially with Wheezy, because I knew her so well, she didn't even have to give me that tight of an outline, and I could start working. We'd talk about, after we'd been going for a while on the New Mutants, and we would, I knew what she was thinking, and we could just get right into it. And then by the time I actually got the plot, it was all there. She was so great at that. She had every important piece of dialogue was there, so I could do the expression, and the stuff leading up to it, she could tweak later.
That's all.
I'm not sure if I have the sort of the sequence right or the order right, but was there any kind of disruption, or was it a quick flow from these adaptations and the epic work to right into the superheroes like Cloak and Dagger and New Mutants?
I think it was all kind of happening at the same time, because, like,
Okay.
as I just described, once I got up there, I was in the office all the time, and so you were just constantly running into people, and they would say, hey, would you like to do this, or whatever. Sometimes you'd just be standing in someone's office and they'd walk by and say, hey, have you got time this month to, so it was very much like that in the 80s. So it seems very natural to me, but the segue out of the licensing things happened once I got there. So I was actually seeing everybody, every office. I mean, the old Marvel, you came in, there was a bullpen, and there was an L-shaped corridor, and all the offices were lined up. So you just go down and say hi to everybody. And on the other side was Archie and Epic. So it was like visiting time. Every time you come in, you stop by and say hi to everybody, and you just never knew what was going on.
Did you take a different approach at all to different kinds of projects, like the more straight ahead adventure superhero versus the more independent epic ones versus the adaptations? Or was it really just, a different kind of work, and, you approach them basically in the same manner?
Well, I have to be honest, and I can't claim to remember that I did a lot of thinking about that as a separate line of inquiry into the project.
Right.
Because you get excited about whatever it was and start trying to think of the most dramatic images or the mood, whatever it was, and just try and bring it to life as best you can. Because I remember they said there was two things that were said to me as a kid. I started going to conventions when I was 12 and meeting people. And Joe Kubert told me once, you show them, they were all very nice those days. And he said, here's what I'm going to tell you. If you want to make a living in comics, you have to get your skills to the point where if you only have 5 days to do something that would normally take you 3 weeks, nobody but you can be able to tell that. And I remember thinking, well, that's it then. How can anybody do that?
Right.
And then Dick Giordano told me, he said, another thing to be successful, comics are a collaborative medium. It's not your job to judge how well or poorly the writer has done his job of conceiving. Your job is to tell the story and let the reader decide if it's any good or not.
Makes sense.
So I had those in my head all the time. So I wouldn't come in thinking I'm going to bend this around and put my stamp on it. It was more like, how can I best enhance this as well as I can to make it as appealing to a reader? So it didn't seem like there was a conscious effort to bring a certain kind of stylistic treatment to anything. I don't remember much of that, unless it was inherent in the project. So with the Bozz, there was a lot of, when I had enough time, I would do a lot of pen and ink tonal rendering on it because it was Victorian setting. Or when I did the Indiana Jones thing, I was thinking very much of like the 30s, 40s newspaper strip feel to the rendering. So whatever would be suitable. But I will say, because I've been asked this a lot from young cartoonists, who will ask me, when you came onto this book, you just did it your way. I mean, why didn't you get any pressure? And in those days, there wasn't that pressure. There wasn't a sense of this is the way this comic book looks and everybody has to get in line. It was more like, if you can do it by the end of the month, do it.
Right.
It was much more open, and they wanted you to put in whatever enthusiasm you could bring. So I don't remember anybody ever telling me don't draw like that, or this looks too weird. Or
we'll talk some more about the books you worked on, but I'm curious for you, are there certain books or certain projects that are sort of evolutionary points for you as an artist where you can see yourself changing or evolving, and what would some of those works be?
Almost in those days, it was happening constantly because I was so young, and I was just learning, studying constantly. When I got to New York, the first time I went out there, I lived in Connecticut, and I was aiming to go there, Westport or Norwalk, I don't know, it's very close to each other, because that's where Walt Reed's illustration house was, and had all the history of illustration stuff in it. I said, I'm going to meet that guy, I'm going to be friends with that guy, and I'm going to roam through all that stuff, which is what happened. So it was great. But also, I immediately got into a studio with Bill Sienkiewicz, Joe Chido, Brent Anderson, and briefly Tony Salmons. So that was great because everybody's just feeding their enthusiasm in every day. And Bill was right at the beginning of moving out of his traditional sort of Neil Adams based way into bringing all these other illustration elements. So that was very exciting. So there's just a constant enthusiasm. And any other artist you would meet, that's all you talked about was, oh my God. In those days, sometimes it was hard to find reprints of a lot of classic stuff. Like everything's available now. So if somebody had something, they brought it in. It's like, oh my gosh, you've seen some Hal Foster that you've never seen before. And that kind of interaction would inspire you. But for me personally, I used to do this thing that I now don't, I'm not sure if it was a great idea, but I used to take a job if it was offered, especially if I didn't have any empathy for the subject matter, thinking that by the time I finish this, I'll have learned how to draw tanks or whatever it is. And it did work in that way. It did stretch me a lot. But I remember feeling a real shift in my capacity when I was doing the New Mutants.
Okay.
Because of the sheer amount of characters that were in it. You know, I mean, you had 7 or 8 of them, plus their side characters, plus whoever they were fighting. I mean, there was an amazing amount of drawing to get all that stuff in there. So I had to get more productive, you know, which brought out more, I don't know what you call it, seasoning, I guess.
Right.
You know? You're under pressure and you sort of get through it. And then after that, you picked up that extra energy. Or
I wanted to dig a little. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking that after that, I did some horror stuff, which was fun. I did some Nightbreed for Clive Barker, Nightbreed stories. And that was also for Epic. And I was able to paint some covers. So there I was able to get, that was a little bit more graphic and gnarly. Dan Chichester wrote those. So that was that was a real moody kind of thing with a lot of black, shadowy kind of work. So the project would give you the opportunity to feel like you could move to a new arrow in your quiver, I suppose you could say. It's another realm of something that you could now add to your skill set. You might put it that way.
I'm glad you mentioned New Mutants. It's one of your series that you were on the longest, or you did the most issues of, and I think you did really great work there. Could you tell me a little bit about how the project came to you?
Well, again, you know, when I think back on it now, it was almost where like all these people became my friends. You know, I should take before I get to that question, I'll just briefly tell you when I came to New York for the very first time. My wife and I, they flew us out to do those corrections on the Dark Crystal that I mentioned. Well, they put us up at a small hotel, ancient hotel that looked like something out of, you know, Maltese Falcon or something. You know? And so we get up the next morning and we're all excited because we came in late at night. So we're going to go to Marvel for the first time. And I'm getting ready. I'm standing at the dresser, you know, adjusting my collar or whatever. And I hear this knock and then a gasp. And the door swings open slightly. And this lady peers around. She's got a clipboard. She says, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "Your door wasn't locked." "I don't understand that. I was sure I locked it." She said, "Honey, you do not leave your doors unlocked in New York City." And so we get to Marvel, we meet Wheezy and everything. We're having a great time. And sometime during that morning, I told her that story. And she didn't really laugh. So by the time we'd been with the hits in the back and everything, she says, "Look, I think you guys better come home with me." So she called Walter and said, "Look, I got these 2 puppies here. I don't think they should be alone in the city. I'm bringing them home to stay with us for a week." So I moved in Walt's apartment. That's how I met him. And so they've been dear, dear friends ever since then. So when I had the opportunity to work with Wheezy on that, of course, I was excited to do it. But before that, I had done one with Chris. That was much more serious, heavier. And I'd done an X-Men, I think, and I worked on some of the annuals. But what happened there was they wanted to, the editorial direction that we had was that they wanted to separate it from the X-Men by making them younger. Because they were almost like a second X-Men. So they wanted to drop their ages a little bit and really make them more like kids who were in school, you know, learning how to handle their abilities and all that. So they gave me some drawings. I think they were by J.R. Jr. I'm not quite sure, but they were kids. And because of his stylization, he's very cartoony, design-based style. So they had really big heads and thin necks. And I think I took that a little bit too literally. When I look at those first things I did, they're very strangely proportioned. But then we got out of that, you know. But Wheezy is so sensitive to that kind of interplay of young people. I mean, that's one of her great strengths. And so Ann Nocenti was the editor. And she asked me, and Wheezy asked me, and I said, yes. That's how it started.
And when it started, I know you weren't immediately given a sort of regular penciling gig, but did you have any inkling that you would be spending so much time with these characters over the next few years?
Not at the time, everything was just unfolding as it unfolded. But I still loved working with Wheezy and Ann, and Terry Austin was inking it. I think maybe the first half of that run. So it was all my friends. We were just having a lot of fun with it. And I didn't know how long it would go. I mean, I didn't have any plan, or I just was loving doing it every month.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, with the X books, you mentioned before that they were becoming this juggernaut, that they're sort of
Right.
growing and growing, and there's more characters left and right.
Yeah.
What was it like for you being in the middle of that, seeing this sort of rush that X-Men and the X titles were becoming the forefront of the Marvel Universe?
Well, it was very exciting because it was so much fun. I mean, that concept, as you know, is so elastic
Mhm.
that you can get any type of character you can imagine, and any kind of power or ability or history that can fit into that universe fairly easily. It's like Doctor Who almost.
Mhm.
Anything you can think of will work. And so there was no limit to what you could do. And in those early days, it felt like a very small, fun club, because there was only one of each book.
Mhm.
They didn't have all the multiple titles yet. They're doing a special occasionally. And I think they were doing it because Wolverine had broken out as the most popular character. They would do a Wolverine story on its own or something. But they didn't have I can't even keep track of how many X books there are now. So it was very, casual and fun, and the whole atmosphere was very freewheeling. Like I said, if anybody had an idea that sounded like it might work, try it, because I've had people ask me about planning for the continuity in visual ways for the Ultimate Collection. And I have to tell all these young artists, for all we knew, this was never going to be reprinted again.
Right.
In those days, it was going to be on the stand for 30 days, and that might be the only time you'd ever see it. We didn't think about it being collected or making sure everything was lined up in that way. So it was very organic, and it had its own kind of momentum that formed because of everything that was happening, and comics were kind of becoming cool. You'd see a mention in other media. I remember seeing ads for the X-Men in the subway, which was pretty new in the mid 80s. And there was just, like I said, there was just an atmosphere of, how much fun can we have with this stuff? There wasn't this heavy editorial weight that seems to be a stumbling block now for a lot, from what I hear from a lot of people. It was a wonderful time to be doing it. I'm so happy. I didn't plan it, didn't know it was going to end, but I sure loved it at the time.
I spoke to a couple of people who were working at Marvel at the time, and besides the books sort of being X-Men in their own universe, but the folks who worked on X-Men were sort of with their own little enclave to themselves. Did you feel that you guys were sort of your own group, and then there was other folks working for Marvel, or is it pretty much wide open?
I didn't feel that, but I knew that that was sort of the spearhead of all the energy that people were paying attention to at Marvel. But I was a kid,
right?
I was like 24 or something. I wasn't really aware of all that kind of other elements to it. I was just working with all these people that I loved and having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I didn't really think about the wider context of it being a part of a movement or part of a publishing empire, or
right.
But I do know that because people tended to work together over time, if they had a good rapport, you had things like the X-Men office, Spider-Man office, the Avengers, or those characters that were they hung out a lot together because everybody was working on them every month and getting into a rhythm. So it was like that too, where the actual set of people producing it wasn't like they were trying to exclude anybody or create a private club or anything. It was just the fact that these are the people you were dealing with all the time kind of made it your group.
So I wanted to move on to maybe a sleepier corner of the Marvel universe, which is Sleepwalker. I have a little bit of a soft spot for that character. I'd love to know how the project was developed and whether you were the ultimate designer of the look for that character.
I think the look for that character is mostly Bob Budiansky
Okay.
because he had a drawing. Because that idea had been around for maybe a decade.
Right.
I think I don't know if it was called Sleepwalker, but he had the basic idea for a long time. And I definitely remember seeing a sketch. I mean, I'm sure I modified it to fit to make it easier for me to draw or whatever, but it was not very much. I think I even did an ad that one of the early ads, I inked a drawing Bob had done of the character. But he definitely had the no nose and the bug eyes and the uneven wraps, he had all that sketched out. And he just, that's part of the new universe, right? Is that right?
I think that was part of the late 80s, early 90s when he had Dark Hawk, Sleepwalker.
Because I do remember Shooter, I remember that idea where we're going to create a separate set of characters like the original Marvel days in the early 60s, so that if they want to, the kids can get on board with their own universe from the first issue. Was kind of the idea of doing that set of stuff. So Bob called me and said, I want to do something that's has that flavor of the early Marvel. And he also was a big DC fan when he was a kid. So he loved the Justice League and Green Lantern, I think he really liked from the late 50s, early 60s. And he wanted to bring some of that vibe as well. And I love humor. I mean, one of the things I loved when I was a kid was Mad. Just loved it. And I love Carl Barks, like I mentioned, Dennis the Menace or any of that stuff. So there was a slightly light-hearted aspect to it when he was talking about a villain who had an 8-ball for a head, and things like that. I just thought this sounds like a lot of fun, and it was. I really enjoyed doing it, and it seemed a little bit less heavy because by that time, Miller had done Dark Knight and Killing Joke had come out, and The Watchmen, and it just, that's not my favorite comics. There's amazing craft in them. I don't want to criticize them in that way, but I find that heavy injection of very gritty reality into these very fantasy-based characters an uncomfortable fit. I have a hard time staying with it. So this seemed lighter, like going back to something that was more kind of early Marvel spirit, So that's why I was attracted to it.
It's interesting you say that because my next question was going to be about Night's End, which is coming off of Nightfall. And, that's a darker Batman. That's, his back being broken, Azrael, a lot of moving pieces. Seeing that it was a darker comic, what were your thoughts about the project in general? And do you think it really helped move the needle for the Bat universe at all?
I do, but I have to qualify what I'm about to say by my whole relationship with Batman really altered by working on the TV things, from Batman, Batman Beyond, Superman, the Justice League, all of that stuff. I also worked on Brave and Bold, which was a real lighthearted. So I didn't mind that. I mean, it wasn't like I was feeling like I was out of sync with it or whatever, because you try to bring whatever drama you can to whatever the narrative is. But I had, well, I don't know if I don't want to say anything that may not be accurate, but I'm trying to remember exactly how it went. But at Marvel, they had sort of changed a lot of the hierarchy of the way things worked, so that I know the editors were getting a percentage of the sales and things like that. So it became this mad emphasis on selling more copies every month at anything that they could try. So that freewheeling atmosphere I'm talking about had begun to break down, and it was a lot of stress that I hadn't felt before, just in the pressure of trying to, Image had happened, so that they were trying to make everything sell that much.
Right.
And so there was less emphasis on trying to get a continuity of story going, but try to think of some gimmicky, explosive event to throw on the cover and try and get more people to buy it. And I was just becoming a little detached from the warmth of the feeling of storytelling. And some of the plots I got toward the end were pretty light.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot to work with. And I was getting a little tired of that. So Archie was one of my dear friends too, Archie Goodwin. He had left to go to DC by then. Mm-hmm. And so I called him and I said, this is kind of getting me down. Is there anything at DC? Because the thing is, I had a contract at Marvel. I was an employee, and which was terrific because they gave you health benefits and all this stuff. It was, no problem. I never had any objection to that. So I was concerned about giving that up. Mm-hmm. But Archie offered me the DC version of that. Okay. So, because when I switched over to DC, my wife was pregnant with our daughter, my second child. So I was concerned about that. So they got all that worked up. But the first thing I did for Archie was a retelling of the first meeting of Batman and the Joker, mm-hmm. written by Denny. And that was a ton of fun, because the other thing was DC was still working with scripts.
Okay.
So that was an appeal to me too. It's like, I'm actually going to get a story where it's all there. Okay. And I can not have to wing it, just filling up endless pages with fight scenes. So that was an appeal as well. But as far as Batman himself, I do think that era did turn it in a darker direction. Mm-hmm. That it also, it seems to be that it fractured it into so many divisions as well, because, I don't know how many Batman books there were then. Right. There's nowhere near as has been since then. It's like there's just so many. Yep. Extrapolating. And what I think Bruce Timm's crew understood so well about the character was that he's essentially like a mythological inversion of cause and effect. So he has this terrible thing happen to him, and he's so angry that he uses all the intimidating dark energy from his tragedy, but he justifies that by only using it for good purposes. Right. And, the real character is Batman. Bruce Wayne is the second identity there, because he's so obsessed with it. And playing that off as how would I put it, like almost a symbolic darkness, as opposed to an actual darkness. Right. So the atmosphere is dark. There's a lot of heavy, moody things about it. I'm talking about the original run, because I think recently they've done some really, really dark stuff. Yeah. But that up through the end of the Justice League, we'll say, that version of Batman, mm-hmm. And Batman Beyond had that seriousness to it, but any 7-year-old could enjoy it. So to me, that's how these characters work, mm-hmm. because this may sound a little silly, but for me, all the Marvel characters, all the DC characters, at least from that era, they live in the same universe as like Peanuts and Pogo. They're cartoons, right, designed for young people's entertainment. And the simplicity of the concepts allow them to tell all kinds of wonderful stories that are very fun. They're very fun to read without it being depraved, right, or vulgar. It seems to me that it collapses of its own weight. Mm-hmm. I'm in the minority here, but that's kind of my feeling about it. It's, if you can't really tell any difference between the actions of the hero or the villain, we only know the hero is a good guy because he's going to end up taking this guy to jail and not killing him. Yeah. I don't know. It's not as interesting to me as someone trying to, hold on to their integrity of mission, I suppose. Which isn't to say there hasn't been fabulous comics done that are very, very dark. but that's not my favorite way to approach these characters.
I think particularly in animation, as you've been describing, it lends itself somehow to, you know, this balance where if you just tip too dark, it doesn't, I don't think it even looks good
Yeah.
in some way, you know. And so I, I I can totally understand where animation, you have to strike that balance. You really have to be kind of light and also very direct in sort of the delineation between, you know, good and evil.
Yeah.
It just works. It just works better. I don't know. I can't explain it either, but
Well,
I
I
agree
think,
with your point.
yeah, I think that, you know, in addition to what you're saying, the medium kind of calls for a certain kind of simplification, especially
Sure.
television animation, where you don't have the money to do like a Pixar level animation. But in those days, they were still on the networks. So this had to be for all ages.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so clever that some of them are, the content of the character dynamics are very dark in some cases, and mature, especially in Batman Beyond, they got into some dark stuff. But still, any 8-year-old could see it and just think it was cool.
Right.
It wasn't like shocking or just unnecessarily grim. You know, I mean, this is not an original statement, but if Bruce Wayne wanted to do the best he could for Gotham City and combat crime, and he's a billionaire, there's so many more effective ways to do it than dress up like a bat and beat people up. So if you're going to go with that, then there's certain limitations on how real you can make it, you know. Um, so and again, using drama, you can imply all kinds of stuff that you don't actually. One of my favorite, I didn't work on this episode. One of my favorite lines from first or second season of Batman. It's a story with takes place at Christmas. The Joker ends up being in it, but in the beginning, Batman and Robin are patrolling. Nothing's going on. So Robin says, "You know, it's Christmas. Why don't we take the night off and let's go home and make some popcorn, and we'll watch It's a Wonderful Life." And Batman says, "I've never seen it." He says, "You've never seen It's a Wonderful Life?" And Batman says, "I could never get past the title." You know, I mean, that's the character,
Right.
Yeah.
summed up in that one line. And the endless invention of the writers and the team came up with to play off that concept. I mean, how many hundreds of episodes were there altogether? A lot. And most of them are really good. I mean, I think in terms of the amount of stuff they had to do under the speed they had to produce it, the writing quality, the level of quality of the writing on those shows they're still fun to watch, you know.
Yeah. I think they're classics.
Yeah.
And to that point, I'd love to know, because you worked on them and obviously you worked on comics, how do you compare the two, storyboarding versus your comic book work? What are you know, the favorite aspects of one versus the other?
Well, in storyboards, your work isn't really known to the audience, for one thing, because you're basically directing it on paper, but the animators are the actual artwork that's seen. And then it's combined with the music, the actors' voices, and all that. But it's a much more demanding kind of storytelling, which I really love. I love film language. And it's an enormous amount of drawing. I mean, it's ungodly amount of work. But the way you work continuity into, you know, film is all about time. You know, the director shows you something, he chooses the time and he chooses how he's going to show it to you. If it's a close up or whatever, you know, it's all, you're passive and you have to hold the attention. I mean, you can read a novel where two people sit at a table talking for 200 pages and be fascinated, but you can't do that in a film. It doesn't work. Something has to happen, you know? And so it's a more demanding, also because everything is in that rectangle. Not that you can't do a bigger rectangle to make it feel more impactful like you can in a comic, you know? So a comic has a lot more freedom of not only design elements in terms of how you can do panel layouts, you can have figures breaking out of panels, there's all kinds of things you can do. But as I said before, so much happens in the gutters that you're really hitting highlights. So you can use that to achieve different kinds of rhythm, because a film is relentless. If you confuse the viewer, they're lost. And there's so many meticulous things you have to pay attention to that you may not think about. I mean, like if someone walks across the room and opens a door, that's not as easy to make clear as you might think, depending on what else has to be told in that same sequence. So all that stuff has to connect. If you suddenly don't know where the characters are in the room because the cutting is odd and the characters are jumping back and forth in the frame, it just turns into a mess. So it's a very rigid discipline, as opposed to comics. As long as the person speaking first is on the left side of the balloon, you can do anything, or left side of the frame. So there's much more freedom to suggest, and the reader is also cooperating with you to make the story happen.
Right.
You don't have that timing control. If they want, they can look at the last panel first. There's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah.
So you have a different kind of rhythm. And usually with a comic, you want to do something on the last frame of each page that makes the reader want to see the next page. So there's a different kind of rhythm that happens. It's really a page rhythm, or at most two pages facing each other rhythm. But Mignola always works 2 pages at a time. Mm-hmm. But in the old days, you didn't know where the ads were going to be. Yep. You couldn't do that back then. It's a page rhythm to be safe. And there's a lot more freedom of stylistically, because obviously in a comic, what you're drawing is going to be actually printed. So a storyboard can be rough. If you're running out of time, you don't have to render everything. I came from comics, so my boards tend to look very finished just because that's the way my brain works. But if you are running out of time, you can leave them very loose. But a comic has to have a certain level of finish. So there's those 2 different elements. I mean, there's a lot more opportunity to do different kinds of rendering, and you can play with stylistic distortions within a comic, even with the same character for effect, that you really can't do in animation as much. It's got to be recognizable instantly because it goes by.
Right.
And that's the thing. You don't have time to turn it. I mean, you could stop it and rewind it now, but kids usually weren't doing that.
No.
So, and the rhythm is broken if you do that too. So you want to build that tension. So I don't know if I made that unclear or muddier than the question, but yeah, each thing has its own set of parameters that the comics are much more flexible. So you can, I mean, in fact, there's a lot of great comic book artists who couldn't do boards. It's a totally different mindset. But they do great comics. I mean, it's not like they're not great storytellers, but the medium of film is, like I said, so much more restrictive that it was too confining for them. It's too, I mean, we used to have to do things like if you had a character who, let's say he's in a stairwell in a building, they're sneaking or something, they come through the door and come up to a landing. Well, to get the nice pose where it stops on the landing, you have to do a step map and show the right and left footprints to make sure it ends on the right pose. I mean, you don't have to do stuff like that in a comic, and you got to number them, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's very meticulous to do a board, which if you like that kind of thing is part of the appeal.
Right.
But comics are much more freedom there.
I like everything you had to say. And it was very clear. The distinction between the mediums or the media of film and TV being more of a passive experience where you're receiving these images and you can't really stop or modulate, how you're taking it in, versus comics, which seem to be more of a active experience where you are using some sort of imagination to fill in those gutters and the spaces between the panels is really an interesting way of thinking about it. And I think I'm gonna think about that as I'm reading comics and watching cartoons tonight. So I appreciate that.
And when you see how many different ways there are to do comics, I mean,
Yeah.
just the
Right.
broadness of the type of artists who do really great work. I mean, if you compare something like Barry Smith's super meticulous work to somebody like Robert Crumb, or even something much more simple than that. I've read a lot of these modern YA graphic novels,
Hmm.
and some of the styles are so incredibly simple.
Yeah.
I look at these things and think, boy, if I could get my head around that, I could do 20 pages a day. But the storytelling, if the characters are compelling, you don't think, my gosh, this is really simple. That guy's head looks like a bean.
Mhm.
If the characters are compelling, it's like, again, Peanuts. I mean,
Yeah.
if you actually saw a real child that looked like that, it'd be pretty frightening. But in the context of the line art and the flow of the design, it's the same with Snoopy. I mean,
Right.
that's a pretty mutated dog, but it works. So that kind of immediate, very handmade quality of comics, where if you now it would be a tablet on a computer, or you could do it in a sketchbook. Anybody can make a comic, and it can be very compelling. It requires a sense of story and some kind of appeal of character and drama, or it could be comedy, but what I mean is compelling enough in its narrative to make you want to follow it. But it's way less restrictive than film. You can, any crazy style you can think of, you can make work.
I just want one quick follow up on that because we talked comics, we talked storyboards and animation. Could you have seen a life where you just did one of them, or did you need to do both of them to become the artist that you are now?
The last statement is absolutely true. I'm the artist I am now because I did all that stuff.
Right.
Whether I would have felt the need, it's hard for me to say accurately looking back. I mean, I always loved any kind of picture making. So for a while there, I left when I was doing boards. I did occasional comics. I think I did a few comics of the show. I did a Superman, a Supergirl.
Mhm.
And then I was doing odd things here and there. I did a graphic novel of Redwall for Penguin,
Okay.
that Brian Jakes series of books.
Mhm.
So I was doing different, and that was all tonal work. So I was doing different kinds of illustration, but I also was doing paintings, and I had work in a gallery for a while. I love that too. I love to do life drawings.
Mhm.
Anything that is got a kind of an essence of consciousness in it. That's what I realized over time.
Right.
I not terribly excited by doing landscapes. I did some, but I need some sort of human consciousness, even animal consciousness, so I can act a little bit. And as long as I'm doing that, it doesn't matter what the medium is.
Right.
So the way I'm trying to answer your question is, my interest would have taken me anywhere that came up. So if I had lived 80 years earlier, I would have been trying to do illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and things like that. But because of the era I was in, it was mostly comics. And then the animation kind of grew out of it. I was doing the same characters, basically. I mean, I did Ben 10, I did some stuff for Disney. I did a lot of different things over the years, but that same telling a story and getting inside a character's head and trying to convey the impact of what's happening through their emotions.
Right.
That's the thing that most interests me about making any kind of visual art.
And we are back once again, and Bret could not have been a nicer guy taking the time to talk to us. I mean, again, as you say with so many of the other guests, we kind of scratched the surface because he has done so much stuff. But between animation and comics and the comic strip, he's covered so much in his career, and he's done it all so amazingly well. You know his art when you see it, and it was just an absolute pleasure to talk to Bret.
Yeah. What Oren said. I mean, it was just a pleasure to talk to Bret. He, as we said, has such a diversity of work out there. And I always like talking about adaptation and, taking a work from one medium and turning it into comics. And he's done quite a bit of that, including, I think, The Dark Crystal, which we got into, one of my favorite old, puppet movies. And yeah, it was just great to, again, get into all facets of his career, but we could only scratch the surface, as Oren said. So hopefully we'll have him back on again. But that will do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening, for viewing, for doing all those things. Say it with me: rating, reviewing, subscribing. It really helps us get the word out there about the show, and we want to bring you more guests. So please do all that stuff, and we'll see you next time.